In this video, we are going to use animations in UI Toolkit, dynamic theme changes, and we'll finish with adding sound effects. First, we are going to update the Shield's toggle button. We will use scale animations on ship images when toggling the shields on and off. In the ship selector, set transform scale to 1 on all three axes. In transition animations, set property to scale, duration 0.5 seconds, and easing as easy out. Then in ship shield, set transform scale to 1.1 on all three axes, transition animations property to scale, duration to 1, and easing to ease in out. We can now try toggling the shields and check what we got. Okay, we have to put our first USS animation, scaling the images when toggling the shield button. For the warp toggle button, there will be a few animation phases. First phase, warp entry, will start immediately on turning on the warp toggle. It will consist of warp flash by animating opacity and warping, stretching the space around the ship. This phase will be active for 900 milliseconds. The next phase is the warp active phase. The space around the ship is stretched and the ship moves with warp speed. And the last phase is the warp exit phase. Warp flash appears again and the space goes back to normal. For the first phase in the screen glass, on the top, put a new visual element and set its name to warp flash. Create a new selector, warp flash, with properties, display opacity 0, position absolute, size 100% for width and height. For the background color, this color code. Transition animations property set to opacity, duration to 0.3 seconds with ease out. Apply this selector to the warp flash visual element. Then create a new selector with name warp entry, warp flash, and set its opacity to 35. This simply means apply this style to any element with selector warp flash that is a descendant of an element with selector warp entry. And in the C# script, simply by adding and removing the warp entry selector, we can trigger a transition animation set in warp flash. For warping the space, we will have different selector for every background layer. Each of them will scale to a different value. Let's first set animations for every background layer. For selector will be applied to the 4 background layer, stars for A and stars for B visual elements. Its transition animation property scale, duration 0.8 and set ease to ease in. Duplicate the selector 2 times, rename second as mid and third as dot near. And then just repeat the same procedure like with the 4 layer. Then we need to create 3 more selectors. First is warp entry dot near with transform scale y5, dot warp entry dot mid with transform scale y3.5, warp entry dot far with transform scale y2.5. This will animate stretching the space during warp entry. The next 3 selectors will be used in the warp active phase and will just hold each layer stretch during the warp. So create dot warp active dot near with transform scale y5, dot warp active dot mid with transform scale y3.5, dot warp active dot far with transform scale y2.5. And then for the warp exit phase, create these selectors: warp exit with transition animations opacity, duration 0.15 seconds, and ease in out bounce easing, and dot warp exit dot warp flash with display opacity 35. In the CPUI script, add a variable for warp toggle. Save the reference to the actual UI element to this variable and register its callback. Then implement the actual callback and helper functions. In these functions, we are making all the ship speed related updates and adding and removing the selectors in different phases. By that, their transition animations get invoked. Note that start warp active and stop warp active are just delayed callbacks scheduled by UI Toolkit scheduler and are used to split the warp effect into different phases, so USS transitions have time to play before the next state starts, and not just update these 2 functions. The next step will be to split the controls for impulse and warp drive so we can lock and unlock them depending on the ship state. For that, we will create a few more selectors. .impulse control and .warp control selectors won't have any properties. They will just be used to differentiate which controls are impulse and which warp drive related. So apply .impulse control selector these elements in the hierarchy: impulse speed text and impulse speed in the speed panel, and to the impulse drive, and apply .warp control selector to warp speed text and warp speed. Then we will create two pseudo selectors, .impulse control disabled and .warp control disabled, with the same properties: display opacity 40, transition animations property opacity, duration 0.25, and easing is. Then is the script: create two lists, put all related controls into them, and initialize them. We need to define the set controls enable function. It basically loops through the elements in the specified list and sets them into the wanted state. Now we just need to update the onWarp toggle changed callback when we start the warp drive, and stop warp active when we exit the warp. Now we are going to switch to the red alert toggle button. Here we're going to introduce dynamic theme switching using USS variables. The first theme is this current neon bluish one, and the second theme will be the red one, active during red alert. First, open the ship UI in UI Builder. We will add a new visual element to the hierarchy as a second child of screen glass and name it Alert Overlay. Then, a new selector, .alert overlay, will be created and applied to it. Its properties are display opacity 0, position absolute, size 100% for width and height, background color with transparency 0, transition animation property opacity, duration 0.6, and easing is in out. Then we'll create a new selector, .theme red alert overlay, .pulse on with display opacity 45, and one more selectors, .theme red, .alert overlay, .pulse off with display opacity 15. During the red alert, we will switch between these two opacity levels. Now we will create a new USS file and name it themes. Save it in the UI folder. Remove the root and create two new selectors. Set themes USS as active. The first one is .theme blue and the second one .theme red. Open the themes USS in code editor and add these USS variables. Here we are just setting USS variables that hold different colors for a specific theme. Now this is a bit of a boring, repetitive work. In shipUI styles.uss, we need to replace the color codes with the corresponding color variables. For example, replacing this RGB 79, 20, 33, 20, 55 to VAR accent, and then repeat for the other colors. We have to also do this in the toggle button custom control USS file. If you have any trouble, you can download the files from the link below. While we are here, we are going to do one quick fix. Between alert overlay and pulse on, pulse off, we should remove the space. For the theme to be visual in your builder, add theme blue class to the list of classes of the screen glass visual element in shipUI UXML file. Now we need to update C# script. First, we create a few new variables. Then we connect these variables to UI elements and register callback for red alert toggle. Then we implement a red alert toggle callback. Here we are changing the theme and start or stop repeating pulse animation, and this is implemented here. As the last thing in this video, we are going to add sound effects. This part is not UI Toolkit specific, but just add more life to the UI. I'll go through this quickly, but you can always check the code on the link below. First, drag the sound effects into the resources folder. Create 4 empty game objects as a child of a UI game object. Name them appropriately and add one audio source to each of them. In C# script, declare these variables, add these functions. Expand the ship UI attached to the UI game object and add the audio sources and sounds. If you start the game now, you should hear the impulse sound. To manage the other sound effects, as well changing the pitch depending on the speed, the script needs some updates. Now we can press play and check the implemented stuff. Animations and sound effects are present when the shields and warp are toggled, as well as changing the theme when toggling the red alert. Also, warp controls are locked when the ship travels at impulse speeds. With this, we finish the first part. In the next videos, we're going to dive into data binding so we can cleanly manage updating the UI, as well as improving the logic. See you in the next video.